It is a land of breathtaking beauty. Dwarfed by the vast expanse of eastern Central Africa, Rwanda is one of the smallest countries of the continent and also one of the most troubled. In the southern province of Gikongoro, banana groves and mud brick dwellings ring the slopes of the lush green hills. Nestled in this idyllic setting is the Murambi Technical School. In stark contrast to the pastoral surroundings, the school is a grim reminder of a chapter of history almost too appalling to comprehend. In April 1994, over 30,000 men, women and children took refuge in the school. Many are still here. Almost all those who fled the school were murdered. Today, their corpses lie in the classrooms, preserved in the twisted agony of their violent deaths, as a graphic memorial to a hideous atrocity.
It was chaotic and loud, and bullets were flying. If anyone attempted to run away, the Interahamwe would cut them with a machete.
Armed with only sticks and rocks, Emmanuel Marangera and other men fought the attackers while his family hid in a classroom.
They were in there, in that building. We were defending ourselves, and I saw the killers go in and throw a grenade. I saw it. I was shot here in the head. They were bringing bodies out, and I didn't know what was happening. I fell in a pile of bodies over there.
Emmanuel survived. His family did not.
Please refrain from asking me about my wife and children. It is difficult.
The massacre was ruthlessly efficient. In just a few days, 30,000 corpses were stripped of their clothes and bulldozed into mass graves. In Rwanda, incidents like the Murambi atrocity were not uncommon. In 1994, this small country was awash with blood. An estimated 75% of Rwanda's Tutsi minority population was slaughtered in a systematic genocide. The architects were extremists in the majority Hutu-controlled government. In 100 days, more than 800,000 people were killed, which means a staggering average of 333 murders per hour, or 5 every minute.
If you think about what happened in Cambodia, you think about what happened under the Third Reich, these things took years. In Rwanda, it was unbelievably fast. The killing was on an industrial scale.
But the carnage was not inflicted in an industrial fashion. Unlike what has occurred in other genocides, ordinary citizens were enlisted as executioners.
So much of the killing was done by people who knew each other well. It was done literally by hand to a large degree, and it was done by priests of their flocks and doctors in the hospitals and school teachers of their students, and neighbor against neighbor.
We were going to shoot them and finish them off. They said, if any of them escape, we will kill you. That's when I killed a young boy.
In addition to Tutsi casualties, at least 50,000 politically moderate Hutus, possibly many more, who opposed the extremist agenda, also perished. Of those who survived, tens of thousands were maimed. Women and children were raped. More than 100,000 children were orphaned. All suffer untold emotional scars.
Rwandans have a kind of internal hauntedness. Rwandans are not emotive in the way that we are. That's just cultural. Here, we would kind of expect and to some extent want to see somebody cry to kind of know that they were feeling it in a way that we could relate to, and then we could also pat them on the back. A Rwandan would just say something very quietly.
Those who died, my father, my two brothers, and a few other young men from my father's side, including my dad, that makes 12, so those who died. Oh, plus there were 6 other little children.
It literally defies our capacity for comprehending 800,000 single individuals murdered, sometimes with the most primitive instruments. Each one of those 800,000 has a story.
The stories of relatives who were killed still haunt survivors who daily confront the demons of memory.
Everyone in my mother's family died except me. They took away the education that my grandparents were going to give me. They took away my friendships. They destroyed my property. They took all that away from me.
Janet Uyisabye is the daughter of a Hutu man and a Tutsi woman. The innocence of her mixed blood mirrors the troubled identity of Rwandan society. Her father abandoned the family when Janet was a baby. Her mother disappeared soon after. Raised by her maternal grandparents, Janet was 10 years old when she and her family were attacked at the Murambi Technical School.
My grandmother told us to be quiet and lay down. I lay down between a lot of grown-ups. But when I looked up, I saw someone hit my younger sister with a bat upside her head. She fell down and blood started coming out of her mouth. One person opened my grandmother's mouth and put a whole brick between her teeth. She had that brick in her mouth when she died.
Terrified, Janet crawled underneath her grandmother's corpse.
All the screaming slowly quieted down, and the only voices I was now hearing were those of the killers. One of them, who was a woman, said to the others, "I think that little thing is still alive." I could see what they were doing, and a man said, "Let me cut her with a machete to see if she is dead. If she moves, I'll know she is alive." All of a sudden, I felt something hit me hard on the back of my neck.
The wound on Janet's neck is healing. The scar on her soul remains. Recently, she learned that the Hutu father who abandoned her is now in prison, accused of crimes of genocide. He is there with thousands of other suspected killers. Today, the current government calls for reconciliation. It urges victims and perpetrators to live together, no longer as Tutsis and Hutus, but as Rwandans. No one knows this better than Janet. Now 20 years old, she has finally found the courage to confront her father.
What I want is for him to explain to me why he is in jail and tell me why he did what he did.
As Janet makes her way to the prison in southern Rwanda, she wonders how she will react to seeing her father. Should she lash out in anger or forgive him? The same dilemma haunts the entire nation. To understand the divisions that led to the unthinkable catastrophe, we must first understand the time Rwandans call before. Several centuries ago, 3 groups came to inhabit what is today Rwanda. The Twa Pygmies eventually made up only 1% of the population. The majority Hutu came to outnumber the Tutsi almost 8-to-1. Hutus and Tutsis were defined mainly by class and clan, not ethnicity. Generally, Hutus were peasant cultivators. Tutsis were cattle owners. The greater wealth gained from ownership of livestock helped to propel Tutsis into political power. But in pre-colonial Rwanda, lines between classes were indistinct.
You're talking of a population where the vast majority has Hutu and Tutsi parentage in their background. Anybody who was a Hutu who became prosperous enough could ritually shed their status of being Hutu and become a Tutsi. So Tutsi was a porous identity.
Europeans who ventured to Africa in the 19th century further clouded the issue. After an expedition to Rwanda in the late 1800s, the explorer John Hanning Speke was the first to hypothesize about Tutsi superiority.
This is actually very standard 19th century Victorian racism. He describes it as the flat-nosed, flab-mouthed Negro, whom he compares to the baboon and is utterly uneducable and quite a disgrace. But then he says, but amongst them is this other group who are in every way superior.
In 1919, under a League of Nations mandate, Rwanda became a Belgian protectorate. Belgian administrators installed Catholicism, the French language, and reinforced faulty racial science.
They brought in the usual tools of colonization, they brought in some guns, and they brought in some administrators, but they also brought in things like calipers in order to measure the cranial capacity to determine what's a true Hutu, what's a true Tutsi. They actually had something called a nasal index, by which they measured the size and shape of people's noses to determine who was racially superior and racially inferior. This is Third Reich stuff. And this was the foundational stuff of Rwanda.
Belgian Christian missionaries and Tutsi leaders collaborated to consolidate the idea of a Tutsi aristocracy. Hutus were denied government positions, higher education, and were subjected to forced labor. An ethnic divide became institutionalized. By the late 1930s, all ambiguity about ethnic identity was eradicated.
Every Rwandan would be given an identity card which said your name, and then it also said your ethnicity. And these cards became, like apartheid ID cards, they became a tool of social control. This was the apparatus of the colonial state. It was the apparatus of oppression of Hutu.
By the 1950s, the Tutsi elite was clamoring for an independent Rwanda. But the Hutus' simmering resentment towards the Tutsi establishment and the Belgians who supported it had reached boiling point.
It was almost a civil rights movement at that point, and it quickly became a revolutionary movement that identified Tutsis and colonialism as two wrongs to be gotten rid of simultaneously.
In 1959, social tension exploded into revolution. Belgian organized elections resulted in the majority Hutus winning by a landslide, and a violent backlash against Tutsis ensued.
It was the flipping on its head of an unjust system. The oppressed became the oppressor, and in 1959, 1960, as this revolution took place, as violence flared, you saw the first massacres of what many people consider to be the genocidal order.
Immediately, Tutsis began to flee the country. Then in 1962, Belgium granted Hutu-controlled Rwanda its independence.
The truly poisonous institutional legacy of the colonial state was that Hutu and Tutsi were two different races. The real tragedy was that the Rwandan Revolution failed to transcend this legacy.
The Tutsis, in turn, became the persecuted minority. Over the course of the next decade, more than 20,000 Tutsis were killed, and the number of Tutsis who fled to neighboring countries swelled. In 1973, Hutu Army Commander Juvenal Habyarimana seized power in a bloodless coup. The new president offered security to Tutsis still in the country, but failed to effectively respond to the trouble brewing across Rwanda's borders.
The problem the Second Republic could not solve and did not even wish to address and thought would go away in ostrich-like fashion was the problem of the Tutsi exiles.
But the Tutsi exiles would not go away. In Uganda, they formed a rebel army soon to be known as the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. One of its leaders was Paul Kagame, who later became Rwanda's president. In the early 1980s, he had only one concern.
It came to a point where we could no longer continue being stateless, and we could not be stateless forever.
The RPF prepared for the day they would win the right of return for Tutsi refugees, if necessary, by force. When President Habyarimana took control of Rwanda in 1973, the widespread attacks against Tutsis stopped. The president promised security to Tutsis and granted the minority population proportional participation in social and political institutions. The country experienced relative calm and prosperity. But long-standing resentments lingered. In schools, the seeds of division were replanted in the impressionable minds of both Hutu and Tutsi children.
Would often be told, Hutus please stand, or Tutsis please stand. A child would go home knowing for sure they were Hutu or Tutsi.
The teaching of hatred started back in 1959. When you teach a primary school child, you teach him to hate. 17 years, 20 years later, you cannot change, because the brain is like a computer. If you put a virus, then you change completely.
By the 1980s, Rwanda was changing. Economic crises and famine crippled the country. Citing overpopulation as his reason, President Habyarimana sealed Rwanda's borders to exiled Tutsis wanting to return home, effectively leaving an estimated 700,000 refugees in neighboring countries. In 1986, Uganda granted Tutsis in its country citizenship, but after a public outcry, revoked it 4 years later. Stateless, the men of the RPF, the Tutsi rebel army, decided to fight their way back home. On the 1st of October 1990, they invaded Rwanda. Civil war engulfed the tiny nation.